Okay, so we're going to talk a little bit about the conclusion of Frankenstein, right? So by now you should have read up to the end, and you will see that Frankenstein himself dies, basically of being too tired and stressed out, and exposing himself to all manner of trauma and bad weather. In this book, you will see, I mean, it's kind of made a joke of now quite a bit, but during this time period, it was generally accepted that if you got too stressed or you were too sad or too many like shocking things happened to you that you would kind of just like that your emotions literally would have such a heavy toll on your body that you could basically just like fade away and die. And so that is part of what we see happening to Victor Frankenstein here is these shocks throughout the novel that continuously lead him into these like crazy delirious fevers where he's sick and he almost dies and probably he should have died, but then he doesn't die and he comes back and he has to deal with the situation again. And all of that culminating at the end of the novel, um, with him finally just kind of going downhill and like drifting away without the doctor even saying like, oh yeah, it's this is what's happening, this is what's wrong with him. It's just like, oh man, he's got a couple hours left, and then he dies. So um I apologize for coughing. I've had a cold that I got at the airport. So um back to the book. I think that one of the really interesting things about this is the way that Shelley deals with Victor's culpability for his um, role in the monster's crimes against Victor himself and against humanity and against Victor's family, right? So what we see here, which I think is really kind of fascinating and something I'm kind of stuck on right now, is him kind of as he's coming to his death sort of trying to negotiate a narrative and explain to himself what the heck has happened and what he has done, right? So he says, and this will be different on your pages. Maybe it says it's 161, so it'll be thereabouts in the physical book. But it says, in a fit of enthusiastic madness, I created a rational creature and was bound towards him to assure, as far as was in my duty, his happiness and well-being. This was my duty, but there was another still paramount to that. My duties toward my fellow creatures had greater claims to my attention because they included a greater proportion of happiness or misery. Um, so what do you make of this? This sounds to me, on the surface, pretty rational, right? Like he's like, well, I did have a duty to that guy that I created from, the various bits and pieces of corpses that I took apart. But I had a bigger duty to humanity. Um, that sounds fair. And like as you see, he says that like, oh, this is why I didn't create him a companion, right? That's what he's alluding to. But we have, that wasn't the first thing the monster wanted, and that wasn't maybe the first way that he could have gone about fulfilling his duties as a creator. Probably just abandoning him on sight because he was ugly and alien and strange, right? Like as a creature created of corpses would be. Um, he could have, tried to like work out some sort of like creator creation relationship there and like fulfill some of his responsibilities, right? The way it's written, he was too freaked out to even consider that possibility and was just hoping that his creation would like wander off and die somewhere or just disappear and he didn't want to deal with it. And the result is that basically, one by one, every person in his sphere has been killed, right? The creature killed his younger brother. Justine died, like, parallel to that because of the creature's sort of like assessment of human law and the fact that he planned it. So, and then, right, he kills Henry Clerval when Frankenstein refuses to make him a wife or basically a companion, but he refuses to finish the project, right, and destroys the partially assembled body that he's been creating. And then he finishes out by killing Elizabeth, who has just married Frankenstein. So I'm interested about what you guys make of this because I think that Shelley is posing a kind of critique here about not just the um the dangers of science and the dangers of like the reckless ambition and stuff like that. I think she is also posing a kind of critique about Victor's Frankenstein and people like him not fully accounting for the products of their experiments and for their obligations to those that they see as beneath them or different from them. Okay. And I think that that's the key here, right? He says, "Oh, my duties toward my fellow creatures had great claims to my attention," right? And this is somehow accounting for a situation in which he has created a non-human entity that then slowly kills off almost his entire family, right? And the way that we see him, like my duties toward my fellow creatures, like we see him directing that attention is basically by ignoring what he has done so far and being pretty mopey most of the time and making a lot of very irresponsible and kind of like careless and strange decisions. Um, so I think compared to him, it's really interesting to see the kind of reasoning. Like we can look at what Victor Frankenstein says about his decisions, about his experiences, about like the logic of whatever he thinks he's doing, right? And we can kind of see through it as readers. Simultaneously, Shelley creates these really beautiful and increasingly eloquent passages for the creature. And that kind of comes to a highlight toward the end of the book in particular. Let me see if I can find it. Yeah. So around this section, around page um around where does he start talking? Yeah, here we go, around 163. He says, "That is also my victim. In his murder my crimes are consummated. The miserable series of my being is wound to its close, or wound to its close. O Frankenstein, generous and self-devoted being, what does it avail that I now ask thee to pardon me? I who irretrievably destroyed thee by destroying all thou lovest. Alas, he is cold, he may not answer me." Right? And then this follows, and it's like really, once again, like shockingly eloquent accounting for the kind of like emotional extremity that he has experienced and what has driven him to make these kind of like unfathomable decisions, right? Which he regrets. Um, right, and even here you see this, like, do you think that I was then dead to agony and remorse? He, he suffered not more in the consummation of the deed, oh, not the 10,000th portion of the anguish that was mine during the lingering detail of its execution. A frightful selfishness hurried me on while my heart was poisoned with remorse. Think ye that the groans of Clerval were music to my ears? My heart was fashioned to be susceptible to love and sympathy, and when wrenched by misery to vice and hatred, it did not endure the violence of the charge without torture, such as you cannot even imagine. Like, the creature's lines are fired. This guy, it is incredible to me that that we have these contemporary renderings of him as this kind of like mumbling, incoherent, almost like zombie-like thing, when the thing about this story and the thing about the creature that is most impressive and most striking is his eloquence and his capacity to explain his emotional situation and the kinds of the thoughts and like like the torturous state that he's in that drives him to do these like horrible crimes, right? um and over again Shelley kind of like puts us as readers in this position where we have to come to terms with like what can we blame the creature for what he has done, right? Is he beyond sympathy? Is he beyond compassion? Is he even guilty as this as a non-human that was abandoned, basically at birth and hated by everyone and anything that he encountered, right? um I just think that these are some of the really good and haunting questions that are removed from most contemporary renditions of the story. And I'm curious about why that is also. Like, I don't know if it's just too if it's too hardcore, if it's too disturbing. But his eloquence, I think, is what really makes the story, and what makes us come to terms with what the story is doing in a much closer and kind of like much more intimate way than we would normally be accustomed to doing with a story about a, crazed demonic murderer. Um, so that's a lot of what I have to say about Frankenstein. I also think, hold on, there you are. Where are my notes here? I'm still really curious about the role of aesthetics in this, right? Like, to what extent is the monster's hideousness the cause of his situation, right? Um, do we think that it's from the descriptions in the book? Do you think that it's purely aesthetic, right? Do you think he's actually that ugly, or do you think that like his nearness to human appearance is part of it? Because you'll see over and over again that they'll describe him as alien. They'll describe him as a distorted human figure. I think the only thing that comes across as like genuinely a little distressing is Frankenstein's references to cloudy, his cloudy, watery eyes, which is like really not a reason to scream in horror and run off. So I think that there's an aesthetic question there that's kind of curious. Um, and then, uh, what do we make of the monster's actual crimes, right? I think it's really interesting that, in particular, he seems mostly innocuous most of the time, and then kind of flies off the hook and murder someone. And so what you're looking at is this book where the monster is a life that, like, quote unquote shouldn't exist, right? And the price for that, at least in Victor's experience, is that the lives that he believes should exist are kind of snuffed out one by one. Um, as a kind of like direct like A to B causal relationship there, and that his arrogance in assuming that he could control life or should be able to control life, uh, like brings to light how utterly and completely incapable he is of protecting the lives of those around him, or even improving the lives of those around him. So those are some thoughts about Frankenstein. Um, if you haven't read it before, I hope you liked it. And just keep all of this stuff in mind as we move on, because we're going to be like, we will be continually referencing back to Frankenstein as we work through these other texts. Okay, if you have any questions, let me know. And yeah, I hope you're having a great week.